Join the choir.
That's right. It's the commercial announcement. Thank you. Whoa. Oh, one other announcement. The Asian religions, Eastern Asian religions class is going on. We're at our last religion, I think, except we're going to have one more meeting after we're done, maybe to sum things up too. This Monday, meaning tomorrow night at 7, meeting on Zoom. You can find the link through the calendar on the web page. We'll be talking about Taoism. So it's the religion, that simplifies everything. And heaven knows we probably need a break from all the complexities of this world. Dear God, open our hearts, and we lift our whole world on this Sunday and pray like crazy for your goodness, your power, and your love. Amen. So I wrote 2 sermons this week based on today's Transfiguration text. The first was entitled Thin Places, and if you didn't know the term before, I hope you got an idea of it through the children's time. It was it's a fun sermon. Maybe I'll use it some other Transfiguration Sunday. It's all about wonder and mystery. Like the transfiguration of Jesus himself. But as events in Ukraine unfolded this week, that sermon seemed to me to be more and more out of touch with where the world is right now. So on Friday, when I thought maybe, it'd be a good distraction to talk about that, the last couple of days, my head and heart has been focused on the heroic people of Ukraine, and I just couldn't bear to not say what I have to say instead. So, I put this together yesterday. God bless us. I hope it's okay. According to Luke's version of the Transfiguration story, several clouds were hanging low over Jesus on this particular day. The Pharisees and Sadducees were making every day difficult for him. That wasn't the worst of it. The crowds around Jesus were growing, and they were growing more and more demanding. And to top that off, his disciples were bickering continually. He was having a very bad week. So he decided it was time to do something different. He probably knew the fact that if you have a stubborn problem and you try the same old thing over and over to combat it, and you find you're merely spinning your wheels, it's time to stop and reflect and figure out something new. So instead of dealing directly with the disciples' rivalry and complaints, Jesus began to talk to them about what he saw coming down the road toward him, a big M1 tank with his name on a shell inside. He talked to them about 3 things: suffering, Jerusalem, and the cross. He talked about how sometimes you need to save your own life by giving it away. And as I thought, a second time about this text, I realized that President Volodymyr Zelensky was speaking to his people in precisely those terms, Jesus' terms, on Friday. Remember, Russian media claimed that he had fled Kyiv in fear, so he went outside the presidential palace and videoed himself to prove otherwise, and said he knew very well that the Russians were on their way to the capital and that he was target number 1. And he said he was not going to go anywhere. We need that, don't we? Back to this morning's text. While the disciples sat there dumb, staring at one another, Jesus took the 3 leaders of his little band away from the others. He led them up the hill, winding with switchbacks, to the top of that high place where something notable happened, right? No faithful interpreter of this scripture claims to understand it fully, but it came to be called the Transfiguration, which means change or metamorphosis. And as the gospel writers tell it, 2 Old Testament heavyweights magically appear, right? Moses and Elijah. And in tune with the holiness of the moment, Jesus' face shines like Moses's shone on Mount Sinai when he received the stone tablets. Jesus' friends had never seen the like of it. More, his garments glowed as if, they were made of light. And then topping everything else, God spoke, saying, as God did at Jesus' baptism, "This is my beloved Son, don't be afraid." So this encounter turned them inside out. Simon Peter wanted to stay there forever. He said he wanted to build 3 booths to remind everybody of this moment, to memorialize the event. But Jesus just shook his shining head, because you can't preserve the holy like a taxidermist preserves a hunting trophy. You can try. Years ago, I took a confirmation class of middle school age kids up to a Tibetan Buddhist temple in the hills above Ashland in order to show them how one sect of Buddhism worshiped. I asked the guide there if they ever had actual Tibetan monks come to their temple to chant and create sand paintings, these mandalas that they're so famous for. Those beautiful paintings made of colored sand, which are meant to be created in a few days and then destroyed in a moment by the sweep of a monk's hand to demonstrate the transitoriness of life. Our guide said, "Yeah, we have a few of those." And anxious to please us, he showed us 2 that he said someone in authority had given them permission to shellac so that they'd be forever preserved, which of course ruined the whole thing. Anyway, Peter's impulse to preserve the past by building a memorial reminded me that all of us have that impulse inside us, the desire for things to never change, right? The hatred of change, and with it, the hatred of progress. They go hand in hand. God's message to Peter and his friends is, forget about the past. This is my beloved Son. For heaven's sakes, listen to him. Russian President Vladimir Putin is in love with the past. His version of the past, that is, his version. He says the worst thing to happen in the last 100 years was the breakup of the Soviet Union. Now, when I think about the last 100 years, that is not on the top of my list. And so he wants it back in some form, and he appears willing to do anything at all to accomplish that, which is scary as hell. Serhiy Ploki, I'm sure I'm not saying that correct, is professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard University. Allow me to give you his take on the present events in Ukraine. He looks at the whole situation the way a historian looks at things from like 35,000 feet. He says this: what we are watching is the process of disintegration of one of the last world empires, the Russian Empire, which started to fall apart when the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires were falling apart. The Bolsheviks held it together, but it still fell apart in 1991 almost overnight. Everyone was surprised. It was a miracle that there was no major war or bloodshed. Now we realize that the war was just postponed. So you get it? Ploki believes that war we thought we dodged is in some way happening right now. Because, stuff happens in this world, of course, but as has been said, it often takes 8 times longer to unravel, right, than you can imagine. Serhiy Ploki continues, with the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union fell apart. It was not a hot war, but it was a war that was lost by Moscow economically, geostrategically, etc. And now there is an attempt to get the empire back as a belt of dependencies. Russia tried through economic means, then through political means, and now they're at the war stage. It's the last instrument that Russia has in its hands. Ukraine, he says, is important because it's the second largest post-Soviet republic. If Ukraine resists successfully, that puts in question the Russian claim for the rest of the post-Soviet space. It puts in question the attempt of Moscow to somehow recreate not the Soviet Union, no one wants that, that was an expensive imperial project, but establish instead an effective sphere of influence. Without the second largest part, Ukraine, you would have a huge hole in the entire structure. So Putin's goal is either to make Ukraine pro-Russian or dismember it. He didn't succeed in 2014. He grabbed part of the Ukrainian territory, Crimea, but by doing that, he mobilized the rest of Ukraine against Russia. In Ukraine, the number of people who want to join NATO went up by 3 times. It grew closer to the West. Since then, it's been conducting joint military exercises with NATO. It is the absolute opposite of what Putin wanted to achieve. So, Putin's actions are desperate, and they're kind of insane. His annexation of Crimea led to the ousting in Ukraine of a pro-Russian leader who was replaced by a Democrat, President Zelensky, right? The last thing that he wanted. Calling Zelensky now a neo-Nazi is part of Putin's insanity. But look, like all people married to the past, and that's the subject I'm really dealing with here, the marriage to the past. Like all people married to the past, he's totally out of touch with the spirit of the present. He's deeply homophobic, deeply misogynistic. He hates progress of any kind, especially progress that liberates or is the slightest bit inclusive. For that reason, he will make himself irrelevant. It's the fate, in fact, I think, of all leaders like him. But still, let's face it, one worries about what a man like that might do if events go so far south that he's backed into a corner. A Ukrainian woman this week said that one day Putin will disappear and there will be little trace of him. But by then there will be public squares all over Ukraine that will be named for Volodymyr Zelensky. Funny, isn't it, that Putin's number one fan is Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump will be relegated to the dustbin of history too. They can both go there together, hand in hand. It would make them crazy. Even Tucker Carlson seems this week to be leaving the Putin fan club. The idea that Putin will possibly be erased by history made me think of a sermon that I delivered the week Osama bin Laden was killed by our Navy SEALs in Pakistan, way back in 2011. By the time Osama got the ending he deserved, not the martyr's death that he longed for so desperately, but a kind of antiseptic summary execution, he was pretty much discredited and kind of a dinosaur. Allow me to quote from that sermon again. Again, it's 11 years old, because I think some of its conclusions fit with today, which is of interest because Osama bin Laden and Putin, they're all kind of the same. I wrote, I remember so well when 9/11 happened. Many people were saying life will never be the same again. I decided to learn all I could about Osama bin Laden. There was a lot of information available: where he was schooled, who his religious teachers were, what gripes he had with Saudi Arabia, his homeland. It seemed to me that at the heart of his quarrel with the West was his observation that in Europe and America, women were not possessions to be owned by men as they were in Saudi Arabia. They had been centuries before in the West, but this was changing, and it sickened and scared him. He knew his own homeland might be next. Some women were even trying to get the right to drive in Saudi Arabia. Imagine. His actions against the West, taking down the towers in New York City, was devastating, but ultimately not world-changing in the way he hoped. They did not put an end to the progress of feminism. They were simply an angry reaction to the inevitability of liberal progress. His was the last gasp of a medieval impulse. Just then, as Putin's possible failure in Ukraine may be the last gasp of the Russian Empire, we can hope, right? Back to that old sermon. I wonder if some of what we're facing today in this country may be similar. There are forces that want us to take us backward when it comes to freedom. They will not win in the end, but they will attempt to take us 100 or 200 years backward if they can. Well, that certainly has been happening in this country, and January 6th was the apex of it so far, right? I wrote further. I have a wonderful Christian friend who goes to a fundamentalist church. Following 9/11, her pastor announced to all, "We are living in the last days. That's the only way one can explain these events." My friend believed him completely. She said, "I just hope it'll be quick." Well, we've heard all this before. Many in the 1950s thought that the free world's face down with godless communism meant Armageddon, the end of history. I remember reading a religious tract when I was a teenager claiming that the Chinese were putting nuclear weapons in space that would soon rain down fire on the world. It was time to get right with God, it said. J.B. Phillips wrote a book in those days for those who held such views. He called it, "Your God is Too Small." Maybe the disciples thought the same, I wonder, when Jesus was transfigured, that it meant the end of the world. Well, back to my sermon from 2011. Rather than being Armageddon, I'm thinking we're still experiencing turmoil because we're actually in the first days of a brand new era of openness and inclusivity, the like of which we've never seen. We are in a struggle with the Muslim world, it's true, but it's nothing to the struggle Muslims are having with each other. Remember that? President George W. Bush took that tack when he spoke to the Congress on September 13th, 2001, just 2 days after the attacks of 9/11. In as good a speech as I remember hearing from any president from the floor of Congress, he said, "I want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It's practiced freely by many Americans, by many millions of Americans, and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. The terrorists are traitors to their own faith, trying in effect to hijack Islam itself." I was so thrilled to hear those words, but somehow the genius of that approach got lost as we were led into Iraq and Osama bin Laden slipped away. Robert J. Lifton of New York's City College speaks of something he calls the fundamentalist impulse. That impulse is to destroy the world order to save it, in order to purify it. Christian fundamentalists think this way too. Let me note that there are some very positive impulses in fundamentalism. Christian fundamentalists keep those on the left connected to Christian history, tradition, and Western culture. That is always a good impulse and can at times act as a helpful corrective. But it must be said, fundamentalists don't often like real democracy. It's too sloppy. Men, and I mean men here, don't always have the last word, right? Radical fundamentalists prefer a theocracy. Osama bin Laden preferred rule by a God made in the image of Ayatollah Khomeini. Remember? A humorless God of wrath. So, as I said in that sermon, fundamentalists don't like seeing the world opening up to all people. They especially don't like seeing unveiled women on the streets of Arab cities. They like it when women serve as secretaries, not as secretaries of state. They want a world where women ride coach class and they make their scriptures sound like they sanction that too. The best part of President Bush's September 2001 speech called into question the religious impulses of the 9/11 attackers. He said, "We are not deceived by their pretenses to piety. We have seen their kind before. They're the heirs of all the murderous ideologies of the 20th century. By sacrificing human life to serve their radical visions, by abandoning every value except the will to power," think of Putin, "they follow in the path of fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism. And they will follow that path all the way to where it ends in history's unmarked grave of discarded lies." Great rhetoric. As I said 11 years ago, you know, our American version of democracy is only 200 years old. It's still in its experimental stage. The modern age is still just being born. What I'm getting at is that I believe we are witnessing today a contest between the medieval world and a modern world struggling to be born. The fundamentalists, Islamic and Christian, are like Herod's soldiers in the Christmas story, killing all the young innocents in their desperation to save the world. From what? From the newness and liberation that Jesus' real teachings intend to bring. Well, it was true in 2011, and it appears to be all the more true today. Let me say something I imagine you two have been thinking as I close this out. It's dawning on many of those young Russian soldiers in Ukraine that they are on the wrong side of history. The Ukrainian people are letting them know what a pathetic liar their president is, telling them that most Ukrainians will welcome them as liberators. Their families back home must be getting the message too, especially their parents. I want now, as I close here, to give my 33-year-old daughter the last word here. She posted this on Facebook yesterday. "Last night," she said, "putting my kids to bed, I couldn't help but think about the Ukrainian children falling asleep to the sound of explosions rather than lullabies, and sleeping in bomb shelters instead of warm beds, and wondering how many of those kids have daddies in the military like my kids do, and how many of those daddies will never come home. A strange thing happened when I became a mom," she says. "Suddenly, it was like every single child in the whole world could be my kid, and I desperately want to protect them all." I don't know if that happens to all moms or just some of us, but I'm convinced that if the whole world was run by moms, there would be a lot less wars. I know the Russian moms don't want their sons dying in Ukraine any more than the Ukrainian moms want their children and grandchildren dying defending their homes either. Amen.